Okay, welcome. So this is a talk that I've not given that many times before because in a way I have to apologise, it's very intellectual. At least it will seem that way because it comes really out of 40 years of working with these ideas within anthroposophy. So what I've done is in a way distill 40 years not only of thinking about the ideas but actually trying to apply them. So hopefully it's more than just anthroposophical geekiness, you know. Hopefully it's not just a sort of intellectual game. It is actually the result of trying to use them. So it's got hopefully a directly applicable way. And as I've said this before, my idea is not to work in alternative medicine, all right? I'm sort of a doctor. I totally ground myself in medicine. But what these ideas can bring is something to add to. In a way, our concern is always, how can we help? You know, and if there are things that medicine can bring, then this doesn't mean there can't be other things and different ways of looking at a human being which will bring other therapeutic modalities or even just other therapeutic insights so that you can look at it in a different way. So that's really the aim of this talk. During this talk I'll use terms which people who are familiar with anthroposophy will find very easy, but if you haven't, it's very odd. I'll talk about the constitution when I'm talking about the twofold system. And this is something that, particularly if you're working with children with disabilities, profound congenital defects, where it's something that's very deeply driven into the person and it will no doubt be a lifelong challenge. I'll talk about the whole ideas around temperaments. Temperaments are something out of this model, and it's a beautiful idea which was very common and then just somehow got lost, but it's a really useful idea. So I'll talk about that as well. I will talk about a relationship of the psychosomatic, which really the body-soul connection. So it's again something that used to be talked about. They used to use the term physiognomy. Physiognomy was where you could tell something about the character of a person simply from looking at their form or from their organic function. So I'll talk about that as well. So that's the basis, but really if you're, I don't know how people who are not familiar with anthroposophy will find this. They'll probably find it a little bit too much. When you meet anthroposophy, there's so many of these darn ideas that in an attempt to keep your head together, you try and jam them all together into one uber concept, yeah? But what I've found is that you can play too many games, and actually it's quite beautiful to get to a point where you can allow each idea to stand alone and enjoy the sort of the beauty and the breadth of each idea without having to push them all together and make them all fit. And in a way I see it almost as a sort of statement of intellectual, spiritual maturity, that you can actually inhabit ideas which initially seem contradictory, but actually just have their own standalone position. So that's an idea of also why I came to this, so that you can put all 5 of these models up on the board at the same time and enjoy the way one speaks to the other. Yeah, without having to say, oh yeah, but you said that in this and that's that. Yeah, I'm not saying don't think like that, but the idea is just to introduce them. It's a bit like when you're doing Google Earth, you know, and you're looking at Hastings, New Zealand, and you go back and you go back and you go back, and it's beautiful to see where Hastings, New Zealand is in the entire planet. So that's also part of the motivation for doing this. Okay, let's begin. It is also anthroposophy for dummies. Yeah? It's all anthroposophy by numbers. So it's 2-fold, 3-fold, 4-fold, 7-fold, 12-fold. Yeah? So it's a kind of schemata that you can work with. So I'll start on the left side of the board and I'll move towards the right. Okay? So let's start with twofold. And the twofold idea is probably in a way in every mythology, in every sort of religion, there is this basic idea, the whole, all of us old hippies really into the yin-yang sort of idea, Now it's on surfboards and everywhere, but it used to be a Taoist belief apparently, yeah? So there's this basic idea that you have two polarities, and in embryology it's quite a physical reality where you have the endoderm and the ectoderm sitting one on top of the other. You've got this basic duality out of which everything is born. And in the West it somehow got mixed into a light is good, dark is bad sort of thing. But if you stay with the mythologies, you've got this idea of like Ranganui, the father god, the sky, everything to do with this clear, cold, abstract, distant sort of paternalistic picture. And underneath that you've got Papatuanuku, yeah, everything that's warm and volcanic and willful and fruitful, yes, everything that's to do with fertility, and that these two polarities coincide. So this duality is particularly relevant when you're dealing with the extremes of life, when you're dealing with the mysteries of embryology and coming to the earth, and the mysteries to do with palliative care and leaving the earth. It's in a way when these two come together, journey together through life, and then at the end separate again. And I've done, you can do entire embryology courses where you describe the forming of the embryo like the unfolding of something physical, but that there is actually a second process which is something from the cosmos, something huge and gigantic at the same time infolding, so that the actual birth is the sort of magical meeting of these two, and that for the duration of your life these two do a little dance together which changes over the course of your life, and the last thing that happens is they part again. So you can look at this as a primary, very sort of, there is never matter without spirit, there is never spirit without matter. They are always together. So it's great when you're talking about the concepts of embryology and the concepts around death and dying. But in your body, it's physically very much expressed in the basic polarity of head and body. You've got these two, in a way, conflicting principles. This much more to do with the Ranganui pole, all to do with clarity and compactness and tightness, and this very much to do with the Papatuanuku pole, warm and fruitful. Yeah? So we've got this constant battle between our heads and our bodies, our whole life. Head wanting to do this, body wanting to do that. Yeah? Head and heart. But it's also very organically brought into the breathing. If you look at this picture, this beautiful Michelangelo picture, of Adam and God, this is in a way a gorgeous artistic representation of the meeting of the clouds meets the earth. Adam actually comes from the Israeli word red, and it's to do with the blood. And this cloud-born being is to do with the breath. And you can see it quite organically in the actual breathing. And this is, in a way, the story of this dance of these two. The first thing we will ever do, all of us, the first thing, anything we did was breathing. Of course, then we let out a huge wah! But the first thing before we could scream was to breathe in. And quite physically, that is this moment when these two collide. And it is the breath coming in and touching the blood. This is the moment. quite physically, it's a reality of into our very cells. That's the first thing we do. And, you know, when you look at this journey of the breath, you know, the small child is, you know, and you take this little baby home and you're scared to death because it feels like at any moment it could breathe out again. But that breathing journey, this shallow, as we go into life, becomes more and more a deep breathing. And then as we go through middle age, our lung function gets smaller and smaller. And of course the last thing we will ever do is breathe out again, when the two polarities separate from each other. And Steiner came out with this sort of saying that all education is teaching children how to breathe. Now, I don't think he's talking about nitrogen and oxygen and respiratory rates and O2 sats, yeah? He's talking about it on this picture where the breath is almost a poetic, spiritual or higher function, and the blood is to do with this body stream, this sort of Adam versus God. Now, that's a long talk, and I will. So, in the twofold model, you get this area where you work particularly these ideas in curative education. Now, this is another sort of term that gets thrown around. Curative education in an anthroposophical context is this whole world based around Camp Hills and Hohepa, where you're working with children with profound developmental. And this can be anything from autism, Down syndrome, rare congenital defects, or major developmental problems. And there is a whole series of diagnoses within this, which you can sort of summarise as the big-headed and the small-headed. Yeah, so that sounds very prosaic, but you can also talk about the fantasy-rich kid and the fantasy-poor kid, the more cosmic child and the more earthly child. And it's really talking about this basic balance of these two, where the one predominates over the others. And often if you talk to people, we all had a tendency for that in our lives, that we were very big-headed, dreamy children who lived in concepts and ideas and stories, you know, and as soon as you talk to these children, their eyes defocus and they're totally with you. Or the small-headed children who are just running around all the time. Unless they touch it and eat it and smell it, it's not real. So you've got a basic polarity in this. You've also got this in adult anthroposophical medicine in a fabulous polarity that doesn't get talked about a lot, which is the polarity of the hysteric. And that's a word that's really gone out of use now, but even more is neurasthenic. And this, in a way, is to do with the astral body, which we're coming to. And this is the same polarity as the big-headed, small-headed, but now it's to do with the adult astral body. This duality carries on all through these different models. There's always a duality within them. And at some people, the lower astral body is incredibly strong. And it almost wells out all over the organism. They have terrible problems with boundaries. And they're constantly spilling out over people. These are the hysterics. In other people, the upper pole of the astral body, especially through the brain and nervous system, is much stronger, and it constantly crushes down and squeezes the body, and these people end up with hardening illnesses, and they end up with back pain, and they end up with stone formation. So you've got this basic hysteric neurasthenic polarity based on this, but living within this as a diagnostic picture. So it's a really valuable picture that I don't find really anywhere else apart from in anthroposophy. But there is another thing, and this isn't so much to do with a therapeutic application as almost a philosophical thing. And this is why I say it's a really valuable picture around the end and the beginning of life. Because when I worked in curative education, we would talk about this weird thing of, is it the piano or is it the piano player? And it's a beautiful idea because often you're working with very imponderables and you're working with things that you just have to live with. And this idea that we are this physical organism that has unfolded and this spiritual organism which has infolded, sometimes you can look at it, well, is it a problem with this one or is it a problem with that one? Yeah? Is it that the piano is broken and that you feel the spiritual entity around that person is beautiful and whole? Could be another Mozart, yeah? But they're working with this broken, chipped up piano. Or is it that the piano's fine and this spiritual organism has chosen or failed to come in properly? And Steiner talks about this other polarity, and it's used a lot in Camp Hill, and it's a generalisation, but of the Down syndrome and the autistic. As a sort of, Down syndrome is a really profound picture of a broken piano. You know, every cell of the body has got a genetic problem with the 21st chromosome. You pick out a cell from anywhere. So the piano has got a profound fracture, and you often feel with these Down syndromes, the most, beautiful souls who are working with a damaged instrument. But then sometimes you get an autistic picture, and I'm talking not about Asperger's here, but true, profound, classic autism, where they are sometimes the most beautiful people. They're just the most gorgeous, fabulously proportioned, but you feel that the person who was given that, or the entity who was given that mechanism, has chosen or has failed to take good control of it, either through damage or something to do with the process. So although it's a philosophical paradigm, I found it really useful when working with imponderables. Okay, so we've done threefold. Let's have a look at threefold. Threefold was the love of my life. Don't tell my wife this. When I discovered threefold, and I bumped into this idea when I was 18, 19, it's instant. It's an instant love affair because it's totally pictorial and it's totally spatial. So that's the thing about it. It's this beautiful, once you get it, and it only takes 10 minutes to get it, it's so there. And it also is the first of what I would call the psychosomatic models. So what I mean by that is a body-soul model. You've got, again, this duality. It says something about the soul life of the person, the emotional tones of that person, but it also transfers across to their physical well-being. So it's a beautiful model, especially for people like me as a GP, because it's instant. It's a great structural snapshot model. Yeah? You see the person get up and you've already got loads of information. And you can already sort of predict things about the way they have approached their life. So often I'd get called into schools and I'd have to see kids who were problems in the class. Now, what I didn't have was a whole continuity, having seen them go from kindergarten up to sort of middle school. So often this is the model I would use as a GP. So I would just kind of immediately get something about the body-soul configuration of that person. So it's a great GP model. And this is very abstract. But let me go over here and we'll have a look at some pictures. So over here, I've done threefoldness so many times that I can honestly say I've done it to death, yeah? And I started talking about it in terms of minerals. You know, in the old alchemical world, they used to talk about the sulfur, the mercury, and then the salt principles. So I did it like that for a couple of years, and I got fed up with it. So then I did it in terms of the plant. Now you can look at it in the plant in terms of the upside down plant, the root process, the leaf process, and the flowering process, yeah? And I got fed up with that. But then I came to animals. And the great thing about animals, they're so close to us that people get it straight away. Yeah, you only have to describe an eagle. You only have to show people a feather. You only have to look at bird forms and you feel this wonderful, attenuated, exquisite, conscious, sharp, awake, light, airy form. Yeah, and you feel it in yourself. And it actually relates particularly to the nervous system. And you can start describing nerves and they give you exactly the same feeling. These painfully attenuated cell bodies that get stretched right down into your sacral area. Yeah, these delicate nerves that can die so quickly. And then you start talking about this leaf process or the lion, this pussycat realm, you know, this gorgeous catwalk, sort of sensuous, living in the moment, yeah? And that relates very much to this heart and rhythmic system with its breathing and, you know, this purring pussycat world. And then you talk about this hot, unconscious, but volcanic world of the metabolic system and relate it to animals like this, these gigantic, hippo-like, walrus-like, huge but massively powerful things, and you can relate them to the metabolic. And then you can go into a dangerous area and start comparing them to people. And this is the dangerous area that I went to as a doctor. You can start seeing patients that they're almost eagle-like. You know, the patient who comes in like this and is totally sort of wired and wants a reason. They've just Googled something, they want to know, lives totally in this world. Their tissue is tight and dry and hard. Yeah? These people who are, you know, this is lioness chic. This is the, you know, just so gorgeous. You know, I'm too sexy for my shirt, you know. This whole kind of, you know, just living in the moment. It's all about the pleasure principle. It's all about my lifestyle. You know, it's all about that wonderful, I'm just living, I'm out to lunch all the time. I'm always at a restaurant, you know. It's this kind of just ambience driven. And then this, the kind of the salt of the earth, the working classes, you know, I live for my kids, that sort of selfless, we love doing it all together. Let's just do it, yeah? So you get beautiful pictures within that can be immediately useful. And although, I'm going to do another talk about this whole area, you have to be very dangerous, because if you're categorising people like animals, you are actually denying their whole humanity. And really, for this picture to work, once you move it out of the animal sphere and you go into the human sphere, you actually have to add a fourth principle, which is the ability to move. And I love to do this thing, you know, in a lecture, you will constantly move between these three modes. You know, you look out on a lecture audience, and at some stage they're leaning back and they're, yeah, I don't know about this, he was saying that, you know. So you're actually pulling into your eagle sphere. Sometimes you're just enjoying it, and it's so funny, that kid's brilliant. Yeah. Or sometimes you're like, that's brilliant, you could really, you know, you're actually, in reality, we're all moving, But some people are dealt a hand where they're particularly strong in one area. So it's useful not only as diagnosis, the point of it is that it goes also into therapy. Because if you had someone who was extremely strong in this area but almost absent in these two, it already gives you direction of therapy. You know that the person who lives so strongly in their head that they only want to talk about things, you need actually, after you've done a bit of the talking, to get them out of the talking and warm them up to something actually a little bit more artistic. And maybe you'll have to do it even in a gentle, incremental way. You know, you'll have to start with coloured pencils and then maybe use chalks and only then into veil painting and finally into wet on wet. So you can use an artistic process with the aim that eventually you actually get them comfortable with their body and they can just be in their body without having to be conscious. They can come to terms with the unconsciousness pole. So, and any, you can go through all of those in different directions, but the point of it is that it gives you a body-soul picture which also leads you into a kind of therapeutic program. So, now we come back to the board. I'm going this way. And this is, in a way, you can see with these 5 models, this sits in the middle. And in a way, this was much harder for me to come to a relationship to. Because I've tried over the years to find pictures and models, and I can't really, not anything like this, because this actually requires thinking. This has so much more. It is in a way like the central picture of all of these. This is the linchpin, and you can almost, from now on, we're almost drawing out of that picture. Because this has 4 different components, and I don't like the anthroposophical words because they're so muzzy that they just confuse people. You talk about this blue one is the physical body, and now we go into, I've got no problem with physical, but now we get more and more weird. The etheric body. Now that has all kinds of negative hippie connotations, yeah? And this is now the astral body. That's even worse, astral projection. And this is the ego. But these are the words we're given. Ego means so many different things to different people. In Freudian, ego means a specific psychological type. And people say, oh, you're so egotistic, which is nothing to do with what it means here. So I don't know. I'll stick to these words, but really, this could maybe better be identity. This could maybe, astral could much better maybe, I don't know. I like to think of it as motion and emotion. Yeah, it has an external reality that you start to move, but it has an internal reality that you start to emote. You start to have an inner life. But you could also call it, in terms of acronyms, the SDR body. Sex, drugs, and rock and roll. Yeah? This is the body that gives us the relationship with sex, drugs, and rock and roll. Yeah? The etheric body, if you're talking to patients, I can use terms like, formative forces, your healing ability, your life forces. I can talk about your biorhythms, and I can talk about your time body even, in terms of this is something that lives in time. It changes in time. And physical body, everyone's comfortable with that. Yeah? That's what doctors do the best. And if you look at these 4 interpenetrating models, in a way, in the orthodox world, physical and to an extent astral are covered. Yeah, you've got doctors are the absolute geniuses of the physical body. They know, we had to learn the bits, we had to learn the insertions, we had to learn what an average LDL is and a T4. We've been good at that, and that's all of the stuff that you can measure. The astral body, in a way, is what the psychologists have learnt. Yeah, this whole world of psychology and all these psychological techniques are dealing with this. Although, in coming back to the duality model, they're actually only dealing with this aspect of it, the disembodied soul aspect. What it doesn't have, and what anthroposophy brings, is that there is a physical component to that. There's a correlate. And that's an incredible loss, again for therapy, that if you can put those two back together again, you can do physical therapies for psychological problems and vice versa. Yeah? So it's a huge loss not having the second component, but it's there, out there in the world. What the world doesn't have and really suffers from in the paradigm of the West, even though it's present in a lot of the older paradigms of the Eastern religions, are these two. This etheric and this ego. Because we don't have models that reintegrate the whole person. We don't have any model for this idea that there are forces which actually regenerate, that there are plant-like forces within us, and there is also a tide to the affairs of man. Yeah, you know that when you stitch up a young kid's leg, that 2 days later it will be healed. But if she's an 80-year-old lady, 3 months later you're still dressing the ulcer you created. Yeah? So there's a reality to tissue, and there's a reality to those things. And you know that the kid will bounce back in 24 hours, whereas the middle-aged man takes 2 weeks. Yeah? So you know that there are sort of tides and affairs, and there are biorhythms, but there is no paradigm for it. So that's what you get from this concept of an etheric. And also what we don't have, of course, and this is really hard now because we're such an inherently materialistic age, we don't have any way of thinking that our identity or our existential reality has any kind of physical, physiological or integrative path, so that you could actually have a truly holistic picture of the human being where all of these different levels work at different times. And this is hard because it is not like the threefold, a nice structural. It's actually more like energies. Yeah, you're actually thinking more of an energy model where the only one that you can see is this one, the physical. The others, you almost have to develop other forms of cognition. You know, you have to almost develop qualities of imagination or inspiration to understand what's going on. And you have to almost do a detective thing where by watching the physical body you can sort of work out that something has changed. But anyone who's any good at medicine or nursing or therapy actually has already done that. You know, if you're any good, someone walks in the room and you pick up stuff straight away. You just don't have any paradigm with which to, quantify it or clarify it. So these are like 4 different energy levels. The only one you can see is the lowest, which is the physical. And I love this film, a bit of a film, Inception. Inception, I don't know if you've seen it. Mind-boggling. The last scene is 4 different dramas happening all at the same time. Now, the time reality in each one is different. You know, a few seconds here is hours there. So you've got to kind of think about, okay, so that's happening there, which is sort of having a repercussion here, but it's going to take... So this is like the fourfold model. It's like Inception. Yeah, you've got to be able to think in different ways on different levels all at the same time. So it's not like the friendly threefold, which is all there. It's actually a much more dynamic. But because it's so dynamic, it's incredibly useful for anything to do with development. So instead of the snapshot, it gives you that time progression. Now, I've already talked about the sort of etheric thing of a tide coming in and tide going out, or the tides of the day, yeah? But you've also got this idea of a spiritual reality to it, or a larger picture, where you've got biography. Yeah, the fact that over 7-year cycles, things change. You've got the fact that, I was once an 18-year-old man, but when I look back at him, he's like another person. But there is a thread that connects me, but it's almost like a sundered hulk, a form that I was once in. So there is a thread that connects the whole thing, which has a physiological reality, but it is not, it's not there, it's not physically present. And because this is so great as an idea, it's incredibly useful for teachers and anyone working with developing children. And I talked about this coming together of these two poles, but it doesn't happen as it actually is almost like the cogs of a wheel intersecting. You've almost got like 4 levels of intersection. And that process takes almost 21 years. It's not like boof, it's a progressive. And that gives you the basis of a science around the process of development from the 0 to 21-year-old child. And it gives you that different things become important at different phases. It also, and this is a kind of weird idea, has this thing called the pedagogical law, which is just such a useful idea. And it's just like the threefold can give you insight on yourself as a doctor. It can also, I've just slammed the microphone, so that's going to come up really loud on the yourself as a doctor. Yeah, this one can also give you an understanding of how you work on the patient. Yeah, so the pedagogical law says not only does the patient have these 4 bodies, but you as a therapist or a nurse or a teacher or a doctor also have your 4 bodies. And there is actually a way that you become the medicine. It's not just what you're giving, it's what's going on between you and your patient, or you and your child, yeah, or you and your class. And that actually the body above works directly down on the body below on the child. So if you are wanting to work on the child's wild astrality, the sex, drugs and rock and roll in a teenager, you really have to work out of your ego. You have to get to a place in you that is beyond fear and favour. And that place, that kind of cool centre, is really your tool where you're working on the child. And that's a wonderful picture of what we all know as parents, what we all know as teachers, that you yourself are a therapeutic tool. So, running out of time now, so I'm going to have to move on. There's a lot more to say about fourfoldness, but I'm going to give a separate talk on that tomorrow. So, get the DVD box set, obviously. This is whole compile with the T-shirt. So now these next 2 are in a way derivatives of this one. This is, in a way, the 7-fold picture, which has been the love of my later life. Again, don't tell my wife. Yeah, this has been the love of my later life. We're coming to this. This has been such a useful picture, especially as a doctor, because again, it's a soul-body one. It brings back together the fact that you could have a personality type, and that is somehow tied in to the function of an organ. Now, we know that the modern concept is that the brain is the only possible place where any sort of soul psychological activity could happen. But that is very much a modern idea, and it's already beginning to fray, because it's clear that what happens in your body relates to what happens in your soul life, in your psychology. But the 7-fold picture really gives an anatomy and physiology of the astral body. Yeah, so it's because of that, and because of what I said before about this interdigitating of the 4 levels as a progressive thing, it's particularly important with teenagers. Yeah, it's kind of there before, but it somehow becomes very pertinent for when you're working with teenagers. These kind of like wake up. And I know it seems a weird idea that something could be there but not present, but Well, you've all had that experience. You know, if you've ever, you take a baby in your arms, and if you actually just look at it clinically, it's like a giant maggot, isn't it, really? You know, I mean, it's just, it eats, it poops, it pukes, you know, it's wrinkly, blah, blah, you know, but that's not the experience, is it? You're holding this thing, but somehow there's all this stuff around it. And if you're a parent, you've actually had the joy and suffering of watching all of that pour into this great big ugly person that now stands in front of you when they're 24. Yeah, and it was kind of always there. At one stage, it was like this, yeah, and the baby was like that. And when you hold it, you experience so much good stuff to come. And then when they are grown up, it's almost like it's gone that way. And you've got this person now, yeah? This one has emptied into the other. Well, the same thing is happening in this picture, where this emptying out, and that happens in a sequential manner. And this stuff starts to really start kicking in from 12. 12, 14, it's different, it's speeded up now because of hormones in the food, blah, blah, blah. But that's what's the sort of chronology. And then suddenly this whole organic world opens up. Now, teenagers is one thing, but it's also incredibly useful when you're talking about any kind of organisational reality or any sort of social working together. You know, how people work together. You can see different types. You can see in organisation different roles. So it's a wonderful picture of different, now on a deeper level, this connection between soul and body, this psychosomatic connection. So now we have to go over to here to look at the sevenfold world. And here it is. It's gorgeous, isn't it? I mean, it's just beautiful, isn't it? I see myself more as a sort of George Clooney type now, especially now I've got the film career going. It's just a matter of time, obviously, before I get the looks to go with it. But, you know, strangely, even things like Winnie the Pooh, yeah? In Winnie the Pooh, you have this beautiful sort of, these different soul types, these different sorts of personalities who, in a way, personify, and that word comes from, you know, to sound through, in a way, different notes, different tones. And you've got the central figure of Christopher Robin, but you could go through each of these as, in a way, expressing a kind of personality. And I'm getting a bit old with this, but because when you look at Tolkien's work, he's also put that into these characters. So you can look at these 7 different modes as the personification of these different soul types. So you've got the Saturn soul type, the Gandalf picture, and that's probably a good modern house, yeah? Wizen, cynical, but actually huge power underneath. It's all based, he looks like an old man with a stick, but actually there's a lot in there. Now, that is related to the spleen in the organ, the forming of the organs, and that is related to the immune system. So you even get this kind of these memory cells of the immune system that carry the memories of past battles and scars, and when they're awoken, unleash this massive organic defense of something. So you've got not just a soul type, but you've got an organic basis to that. And then you go into the sort of king picture. And this is alive in psychology, but what isn't alive is the organic connection. And you've got this sort of Jove, you know, or the kingly picture, this person who is master of his domain and is balanced a sort of Solomon type character who gives sage but balanced. And that is connected to the liver. And this liver sits across the whole of the upper abdomen and lords it over his whole domain, doing all these multiple and quite well-resourced transactions, moving the glycogen into glucose when it's needed, generating all the clotting factors, detoxifying all the poisons, like a great king, it sits there. And then you've got Mars, this picture Gimli, the sort of, which can be for good and for bad. It can either be an orc slashing his way through a crowd, or it can be the sort of St. George and the Dragon picture. And this particularly relates to the gallbladder, this strong, organic ability to smash food open, which ties in a little bit with the pancreas, but also with the iron of the blood, this iron process, because there's also a metal connected to each of these. And then you have the central figure of this, in a way, this sun picture, this picture that stands, that in a way has a resonance of all of the others, but somehow brings them into a balancing of all of them. And this always was classically connected with the heart. And although the head has become the sort of king of our world, with the modern perspective, the heart still lives poetically as somehow a centre to forces, and it sits on a cross of these organs. 3 of the organs go down like this in a connection, 3 of the organs go across like that in a connection, and the heart sits where these two meet. And that's Aragon, obviously. And then you get to the Venus pole, this beautiful picture, the Aphrodite, this gorgeous loveliness, and that's always connected with the kidneys. The kidneys constantly like the housewife of the body, like the Cinderella, cleaning away, cleaning the blood. And in this actually is Winnie the Pooh. Yeah, this bear of very little brains, but every party is better with Winnie there. This loveliness, this, let's have some sandwiches, shall we? It's kind of always catering, always taking care. And then you have the love of young girls, Legolas. Yes, Slim, he should be the patron saint of boy bands. Yeah, it's like young, slim, as yet unsullied by the world, constantly moving. And that has always been connected with the lungs, this light, fair, kind of furry, airy little organ that's always moving in and out, in a funky sort of way. And that's been connected with Hermes. And then you have the Galadriel picture, this more like the brain, also with the reproduction in the ovaries, but this cool, all-seeing, somehow still voice that is able to reflect what's happening in the world. And so that's a big picture, but what it has within it is a certain correspondence between different polarities, so that you can actually get this duality again that I talked about in the first instance, and that one is polar to the opposite. So, we've got in modern pop psychology, men are from Mars, women are from Venus. But this gives you so much more, yeah? You've also got this kingly activity is actually balanced by this mercurial. So in Shakespeare, you always get these kings with a fool, yeah? And who's the wise man in the end? Was it the king or was it the jester, yeah? So you get a sort of balance there. But you also get this picture of this old, wizen, powerful but grumpy old man, yeah, with this endlessly regenerating, reproducing picture of the moon, this fertility connection of the moon. So it's not just a schema, it's actually very useful. Not only does it give you a whole different way of treating things, because associated with each of these is a particular personality, and if that personality is left unchecked, it becomes a pathology. You can see that, a lack of mercury in an individual would bring out Asperger's. It would bring someone who was very stuck and lacked social grace and had a rather mechanical way of moving and a rather dry and arid way of talking. You can see that you could actually start treating them. It opens up whole new ways of treating them which would not be available out of a standard diagnostic picture. But also it gives you insight into why would one person get heart disease and another person get kidney disease? Why do certain personality types attract themselves to gallstones, whereas other people get kidney stones? What does that tell you about that person? So it's often what patients ask, well, why did I get this? Not that you can answer it, but you've actually got at least the beginning of a way of thinking about it. And finally, back to the board. In a way, this last one, the 12 senses, the 12 is in a way the anatomy and physiology of the ego, which is a grandiose statement. This is, threefoldness and fourfoldness have a baby, This is the combining of the two. So you've got this kind of threefold picture of these senses, which have a kind of bodily, soul and spiritual component, but within them there is a fourfold levels, which much more relate to the physical, the life body, the astral body and the ego. So this is the anthroposophical idea of the senses, which is that it's in a way the whole neurology, not just the central nervous system and these classic senses that we think about, but it's also like the nerve system within the heart, in the Purkinje fibres, and the nerve system within the guts, and the whole autonomic world that's taking care of our life body. And everything, every bit of sense activity is covered here, not just the central nervous system and these kind of 5 classic senses. And they have a different orientation. These senses are going inwards, and it's all about identity. These 4 senses give us this identity as a physical organism on the earth. This gives us the ability to feel that we are here and looking out. And some people have lost that. Sometimes in a car accident they've had an out-of-body experience. That's what it would be like if we didn't have this whole egohood of the body. We have a whole two-way process with the social senses. This gives us the ability to be a passport in the social world, to be social beings that have a sense of, okay, now we do this, now we do that. This is more through the seeing and the hearing. Yeah? And we also have these spiritual, which in a way give us a passport to being beings within the spiritual world. Yeah, this gives us the ability to have a sense of thought, a sense of word, yeah, and even a sense of self, so that you can meet another human being and realise you are in the presence of another spiritual being. And even when I think people have awe, the cosmos, it's actually also a meeting with a spiritual being. So you kind of have this ability to be a spiritual identity amongst other spiritual identities. And this, very briefly, just one example, is autism. If you work with autism, in a way I really feel that's a disability of the ego. It's an ego-based problem. I'm talking again about pure, true autism, not Asperger's or this whole ASD, autistic spectrum disorder. I'm talking about full-blown autistic that you meet now. And they have often very well-founded senses of movement. They can spin things. They have obsession with their bodily functions. But what they don't have is any sense of self. They look at you and you are a foreign body. Yeah? You are just another obstacle keeping them away from what they want to go to. And you can use a picture like this almost as a like Jack and the Beanstalk ladder. That your therapeutic direction is to try and work them up this ladder of sensory modalities to try and eventually get them into a sense of self. But you have to start down here, and this whole Temple Grandin thing where she used bodily senses as a way of starting and moving up there. So it seems like a very weird and abstract idea, but it can be very practical. And always I find that if I'm stuck, I can find something to do out the senses. You know, you can have the most horrendously handicapped cerebral palsy child and you don't know what, they're blind, but you can find something within here. This is like the 12 windows of the identity, of the ego. There's always one window that you can find, even if all the others seem to be shut.